Welcome, everyone. I'm Spiro. Thanks for tuning in. We've been hearing a lot about the upcoming solar eclipse on Monday, April the 8th, and many people have a lot of questions, myself included. Like, for example, is it really that big of a deal, or is it just another eclipse? Or should we be concerned or worried at all about this? Others may ask, is there something else going on that we should know about? Because many argue that there sure seems to be a lot of synchronicities coinciding with this particular celestial event. And at the end of the day, the big question is, what can we expect, and does it impact you, if at all? Well, I couldn't think of a better guest to discuss all of this and more than Richard C. Hoagland, who is joining me now. Richard, thank you for taking the time to be my guest today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Now, Richard, before we dive into a range of topics, everything from the eclipse itself, all the way to what CERN is up to, the red heifer sacrifice, what NASA is doing, what the occult is up to, plus lots of other cosmic events taking place at the same time, and asking whether or not these events are related or have any significance at all, which is a lot to unpack. But before we begin, would you kindly brief us with your resume and background, sir?
Oh, good grief. I sent you a big resume yesterday. You didn't look at it.
Yes, sir, I did, actually. I'll do it right here. I just thought that nobody knows it better than you. So, but Richard C.
I
Hoagland.
hate talking about myself. It's so boring. I'd much rather get to talking about what I'm here for because I have limited time. And this eclipse is like none other because we now know the moon is not what we thought it was. We now know from the images sent back by the first U.S. mission to successfully land on the moon in 52 years since the Apollo 17 mission, unmanned mission called Odysseus. It has sent back stunning color images, overwhelming repeatedly, hundreds now that have been published, showing this incredible artificial ancient ET lunar glass dome completely covering the moon. I mean, haven't you ever wondered, isn't it really amazing that we live on a planet where the satellite, the moon, just covers the sun, so we see this incredible spectacle of the corona? I mean, hasn't it crossed your mind that that's really kind of weird?
So, Richard, just for the guests who...
You're not answering the question.
Well, I'd like to preface by, pointing out your bio since I didn't read it, and I apologize for that. You are, a former NASA consultant. You were the Walter Cronkite's science advisor during the Apollo missions to the moon. So you've been around for a long time. You're a scientist, a broadcaster, an author, and much, much more. So what you're saying right now is you believe that there's, within images that we're going to show right here, that there is a glass dome or a dome around the entire satellite of the moon, of Earth's moon?
Spiro, I don't believe it. We have absolute, definitive, compelling, overwhelming scientific proof with this last mission. So when you look at the eclipse on Monday, this is going to run what, Saturday?
Yes, sir.
Okay, when you look at the eclipse on Monday, and if you're outside the path of totality, get a plane ticket. The eclipse is only 4 minutes. It's the most important 4 minutes, as you'll hear, of your life. You can fly in, fly out. Don't need to get a hotel. Don't need to get a cab. You can literally stand at the airport and see the eclipse if you're in the path and Google NASA's map, which shows which cities are in the path of 4 minutes of totality. Trying to compare a total eclipse to anything other than is like trying to describe the description of having sex with the real thing. There is no comparison. And no number of words will tell anybody, if you haven't got one chance in your life to see this thing, go see it, because the next one here is not till 20 years. Now, why is this one so incredibly different than any other eclipse humankind in the last thousands of years have looked at? Because now we have on Earth tonight a absolute compelling scientific set of data showing the moon is not what we used to think it was even 3 weeks ago. Somebody built stunning stuff in a shell like wrapping the moon in saran wrap. That's about the relative thickness of the glass of the dome compared to the size of the moon. But it's incredibly eroded. It's not the same density all over. That's why we could safely land, because the dome has almost disappeared totally over the side of the moon that looks at us, the so-called Earth side. The poles, which is why we have these stunning new pictures, because that's where the new mission went for the first time, landing a U.S. spacecraft at the South Lunar Pole. And the glass over the South Lunar Pole is so much better preserved. There's a physics reason for that, by the way. And they were able to get down through the holes safely, look up, and take this stunning series of pictures. And all I have done is share, I think, 8 graphics based on these images. There are hundreds. And you just have to go to the official websites, either NASA for the Odysseus mission, because they're a major partner. $108 million of scientific experiments were carried by Odysseus, built by a private company in Houston called Intuitive Machines. So it's a private-public partnership. And of course, I think that's what's been arranged, because at some point, NASA, the government, has to acknowledge what's really there, because it changes absolutely everything, including geopolitics, energy, communications, what we're doing in this existence, this life, who came before us, why we have legends of gods when it could be incredibly advanced, super advanced ET civilizations, why the solar system looks the way it does. Why do we have an eclipse? Because obviously now, based on the mathematics, when the solar system was redesigned, let me repeat that. When the solar system, by incredibly advanced, ancient, sapient extraterrestrials, was redesigned to obviously provide a nursery for consciousness, for intelligence, for us, part of the landscape they built in was putting us on the one habitable planet now, Earth, which has a moon of the right size, right distance. So every spring and fall, give or take, somewhere on the planet, you will have a total eclipse of the sun, which, if you look really closely, will show you the dome. It's that brilliant ring around the moon when the corona is almost invisible, in a special image taken by the European Observatory Group back in an eclipse in 1999, and the bright ring around what would be the moon is in fact a polarized image of the glass, because polarized light and glass interact in a very specific way. So polarized light can be used to see where glass is or where it's not. Remember how you use polarized sunglasses when you're driving west in the late afternoon and you're seeing all the bugs on your windshield. You put on a pair of Polaroids and it cuts out the glare, the reflection from the glass. Well, if you rotate the Polaroid 90 degrees, it will show you the glass. And this is what we want with the moon. I want all the hundreds of thousands of people who are in the path of totality taking pictures of the moon with their cell phone, which won't come out at all, by the way. You got to have a telescope, you got to have a telephoto lens to get the moon big enough so you see the moon and corona. But that's a separate thing. We're going to talk about that for 3 hours tonight on The Other Side of Midnight. So if you want to find out how to photograph this eclipse and how to go down in history by being one of the few that actually photographed the dome from Earth, then join us on The Other Side of Midnight at 9 o'clock Pacific on Saturday night. So, did I answer your question?
Well, I mean, there was a lot said there. So essentially what you're saying, so you're
I
saying,
have 40 years of research behind what I'm saying. We didn't start doing this yesterday. Our science, our confirmation, our data, the evidence from official sources, it all converges. The fact that NASA's not telling you this, and I, a former NASA consultant, am telling you this, simply shows you that they have a political agenda to keep you from knowing, and we have the opposite agenda.
And so NASA released these images on their official website, but haven't addressed them, and nobody else in the media.
No! Now, what's really cool is that I happen to know the head of the experiment in Hawaii, the so-called International Lunar Observatory camera, one of two cameras that this nonprofit based in Hawaii, looking at a permanent observatory on the moon, they put two cameras on this new mission and they took photos and they've released the photos. And the photos show the stunning artificial ET architecture, and the head of the institution, International Lunar Observatory, based in Hawaii, you can Google them, have said nothing. Now, either they got a bunch of idiots looking at their pictures, which I do not think is reasonable, or they are freaked out by what's on their pictures because they did not expect it. It's one of those who ordered this situations, or they're so flummoxed they have no idea what to do because on their images is the first hard evidence seen around the world that the universe and the solar system and the human race are nothing like we've been taught. Nothing. This is not a small revolution. So if the head of the company, who turns out to be an old colleague and friend of mine, who I have sent many emails and made many phone calls to during the Odyssey mission and afterwards, none of which have been returned. Either he's under an embargo by NASA, which is kind of weird because the way the contracts are written, Intuitive Machines and their contract with ILO, the International Lunar Observatory, should supersede any connection with NASA. NASA legally has nothing to do with this mission. All it's doing is paying for a ride for its own experiments. So if Intuitive Machines, whose independent cameras, if they have not announced what's over the moon, and ILO has not announced over the moon, that either says to me they're in real freak-out mode or they have been ordered by a non-official deep state government not to say a word. And if that's going on, we need to blow the doors off this right now.
So, have they been aware? Let's say that there is this glass dome on over the moon, right? They were aware of this before, right? I mean, we've been having space travel to and from the moon and everything like that, or is this something that they just discovered, or is it the first time that these?
This goes all the way back to. I've been working on this since 1994, kind of halfway through my Cydonia Mars investigations. I got very much involved with the moon because my dad gave me for a birthday present a book written by a guy named George Leonard, Someone Else is on the Moon. And I looked at the book and I realized that Leonard was an idiot. And I never told my father because it was the thought, of course. But it got me to thinking, if there was evidence in the Apollo data, how would we know? So I started looking through Leonard's book with a different perspective, a different set of eyes, saying, well, maybe he's not an idiot. Maybe he just doesn't understand what he's seeing. Because he was projecting there were huge construction rigs that were mining the lunar surface and spraying into the vacuum, arcs of material like soil, like placer mining in California in the 1880s or 70s, huge plumes of material. And he spotted these weird anomalies on official NASA Apollo imagery. And so he proposed that what we were seeing were these huge plumes of active mining going on by some ET race currently mining the moon, which of course is nuts. So I looked at the same data and I said, well, wait a minute. Suppose he doesn't understand what he's seeing. So I started looking through the archives myself, and I found more examples of anomalies that no conventional science of the moon that NASA has put forward could possibly explain. And then I realized about a year or so into what I was doing that, wait a minute, there is one explanation which will unify all of these separate images. because I now had accumulated hundreds of official images showing something bizarre going on the moon that had nothing to do with NASA's story about what the moon is and the environment and all that. But I obviously did not buy Leonard's idea because there would be other evidence other than, bulldozers operating madly on the moon if he was correct. I realized that it was the scattering of light from the sun shining on the glass of an ancient set of lunar architecture. And the more I looked, the more I realized it got bigger and bigger and bigger until I have photographs from every part of the moon showing the dome over the whole moon. Now, that would probably confound anybody not raised on Arthur Clarke and later on knowing him as a friend. Because remember, Arthur Clarke got his ideas from a brilliant visionary named Olaf Stapleton. And Stapleton and Doc Smith and, Ray Bradbury and, Robert Heinlein and a whole bunch of those classic writers of science fiction, they thought big enough to realize that if we ever did encounter aliens, it would probably be their architecture first around us in the solar system. And second, it would be of such a scale and such a daunting effort by our own technology that we would view whoever did it as gods because they would have godlike powers of science and technology. Well, the hyperdimensional physics model I've been following for 40, 50 years provides absolute adequate explanation of how you would do this. We can't do it, but someday if we continue science, we will. And if we uncover the suppressed science, which shows that this is possible, the point is, when you look at the eclipse on Monday noon, give or take, if you're way far in the east, like in Maine, it'll be like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, think of that brilliant ring of totality. Totality, this eclipse is 4 minutes, meaning that the moon has to be significantly bigger than the sun in order for it moving at 2,000 miles an hour in orbit not to uncover the back part of the sun, in the direction opposite where the moon is moving for 4 minutes. I mean, 4 minutes at 2,000 miles an hour, well, you do the math. So the sun is going to be considerably smaller optically, hiding behind the eclipse than the moon. But what you're going to see and can photograph if you get the right gear and go to Google for how to photograph the eclipse with a smartphone. And you can still have time to order stuff, still get it. They'll deliver it to you, Prime in a few hours. You look for the brilliant ring hugging the entire circumference of the moon at totality. Because that ring is not the sun's surface, which remember is 1,000,000 times brighter than the corona. That ring is the dome around the moon, refracting the surface of the sun, 93 million miles behind the moon, and you only can see it with a naked eye or with simple optics during an eclipse. And isn't it interesting that someone designed it so we would see this incredible glass structure looking up from Earth every time there was a solar eclipse? And the knowledge of what we're seeing is so ancient. It was A, lost, and B, when it was rediscovered, those who rediscovered it, like NASA, have been covering it up for over 50 years. And we need to find out why. Why don't they want us to know what kind of a solar system we really live in? And if we had another hour or so, I would go through some of the thoughts I've had. But we can come back and do more of this again if you want.
Yes. How much time do you have left, Richard?
About another half hour.
Okay, great. So, because I have some other questions related to the eclipse that I'd like to get to, but staying on the moon dome for right now, let's say, why wouldn't, if it was there, we couldn't see it with powerful observatories here, or would other countries?
Oh, yes,
why would
of course.
Would they see it and not say anything?
Amateurs with ordinary commercial equipment like Celestron telescopes or Meade telescopes, you can Google those, connected to a smartphone, have been photographing the dome now routinely for years. All I've done is go to Google and look for amateur high-end astronomers. By high-end, I mean those with equipment that's kind of comparable now to professional observatories. That's the incredible technological leap that we've made in the digital internet age. Amateur astronomers now can take images of the moon, of the galaxy, of the solar system that are better by hundreds of times than every professional photograph made by professional observatories like Palomar just 50 years ago. An amateur for a few $100 can outdo Palomar from his driveway. So I went on the internet and I looked, and I've got two examples, which I will send to you, of the dome photographed from Earth by amateurs who A, have no idea each other exists, B, have no idea there was something amazing there to photograph, and C, are obviously totally oblivious to the incredible historic imagery they have taken completely in the blind. Completely.
Well, I was going to ask you if
And the
amateurs.
reason, sorry, Spiro, but the reason is, what would you think the reason would be why all of these professionals over decades looking at the moon have not noticed this at all? What's the one single reason you can think of why that would be true?
Well, that's a good question. I mean,
But you've got exactly the right response. They can't imagine it. It's too damn huge to even consider when they're looking at their imagery. It's not even in their universe. It's like, the political game we're playing now, Earth 1, Earth 2. This isn't even Earth 10. Nobody ordered this. Nobody has ever imagined in reality the space agency and then others to follow would photograph stunning evidence of a glass crystalline dome completely covering Earth's only big natural satellite. It's just not imaginable. But sorry, that's the reality. And those who pick it up first will become a part of history. So I want your audience, somebody out there's got to be a professional photographer and put together what I've said, and they will make history by photographing the dome identifiably in an amateur imaging lunar landscape photo from the Earth showing the dome. I would strongly suggest polarizing filters.
I mean, if this is true and people
Yes,
do
Spiro, you've
capture,
looked at the evidence. Can you explain what you're seeing?
well,
Be honest. Come on.
no, honestly, no, and
Exactly. But you haven't had a lot of time to think about it. So we'll talk in a few months after you've lived with these photographs and looked at them and realized everything has changed.
it would change everything if that were the case.
It will.
Yes.
Because you can't, with 9 billion people, or 8, whatever we're up to now, you can't, with private missions to the moon, keep denying it. I mean, don't you find it interesting? And I'm a guy that looks at what we call correlative evidence. It's not just the images, not just the latest images, which frankly, when you think of the whole history of NASA and rituals, which I've laid out now for decades, when I first heard the name of this spacecraft, Odysseus, I had two reactions. One was, okay, well, they're sticking to the, ancient Greek motif. That's where we got most of the names of our missions and all that, like Apollo and Mercury and Gemini, et cetera, et cetera. And then I said to myself, wait a minute, Odysseus, could this be a double meaning naming? What's Odysseus' biggest claim to fame? Does anybody remember who Odysseus was? Does the Trojan War ring a bell? Does the 10-year journey of Odysseus to get back home after the Trojan Wars to Penelope, who was faithful for 10 years, we now know, was it part of the story? Was it a big part? Or was it the fact that Odysseus was the creator, the inventor of the amazing Trojan horse. And what that allowed to happen was that part of a secret coded meaning in the Odysseus mission. Was the Odysseus mission a Trojan horse mission to confirm in the 20th century and 21st the dome? And that's where I've come down. And the fact that NASA awarded Intuitive Machines, remember, Odysseus' parent company, another contract 2 days ago for developing a lunar roving vehicle, a moon car, in other words, means that NASA's not unhappy with what Intuitive Machines did. They're part of it. Remember, you can't tell what they're doing by what they say. You have to follow what they do. Space politics is no different than Earth politics. If there's power to be made, if there's money to be stolen, if there's, worlds to be won and controlled, they will do it. They're all at some level political. It's the ground truth that Earth citizens, like in your audience, looking up with smartphones with the right lenses, can blow the doors off this, because now we have ground truth. We have a spacecraft on the moon that's given us, look at those images, stunning color detail of the astonishing glass architecture in this dome, where it hasn't been almost totally destroyed by eons, millennia, maybe even billions of years of micrometeorite erosion. We have no idea who did this. We have no idea when. We have no idea how, but we know where we can find the answers, because I will bet you dollars to Navy beans, Spiro, they left us libraries. And I think I know where one of them could be on the moon if NASA will call.
Well, there's lots of questions regarding the moon itself, tons of questions. Like, for example, a lot of people don't even believe that we landed on the moon. They think it was Kubrick that did
You know
it.
why?
Why is that?
It's disinformation. If you never landed, you don't have to answer the question, what do we find? It was NASA itself that put out the first stories. We never landed on the moon. This is a major psyops campaign by the so-called deep state to keep human beings in bondage. We're talking nothing less than slavery, because I could spend days on your show talking about the incredible benefits to humankind when this knowledge goes public. Everything changes, and I don't mean for the worse, I mean for the better, except for the oligarchs who think they own the world and all the rest of us and are keeping us in this bondage.
Richard, since we're running down on time, I would like to have you back for a part 2, maybe even
Sure,
after the
sure.
eclipse. We can.
Well, you need time to live with these images.
Absolutely.
You need time for it. I had an old social, he was a Secret Service guy, say to me, well, in Washington, there's something called soak time, meaning the amount of time you politically put an idea out there and then you wait to see the reaction as it soaks into people's consciousness. This could happen. This could be real. You need soak time with these images. It's unfair to make you respond, because once you get it, your life will never be the same.
Absolutely. We're definitely going to revisit it. I don't know what to think or believe at this point, but I wanted to stay on this topic of the eclipse, obviously, and a couple other synchronicities that are taking place. For example, what can you tell us about what CERN is up to during the eclipse here? Is the timing strange? It sure kind of seems like it. Like, what are they trying to do with their mascot Shiva there, with their Large Hadron Collider at CERN during the eclipse?
Well, given that we're not permitted to know all of physics, there's a whole section I call hyperdimensional physics, which encompasses, it overarches the conventional physics that's in the textbooks and people teach in school and learn in college, and it's only a relatively few creme de la creme out of millions of people that are kind of invited inside and know the real physics. In the real physics, which I've been measuring along with Robin using a device called an Accutron watch. We'll talk about why that's important momentarily. But Robin and I went around the world. Robin's unfortunately no longer with me. She died 5 years ago. It's impossible to think that it's been 5 years. But there'll be a couple of photographs of us at Stonehenge. What Robin and I did is we went around the world to sacred sites and measured with the Accutron the torsion field hyperdimensional energies of these sacred sites, mostly, big stone monuments like Stonehenge. We also had the advantage of being able to measure, I think it was 3 eclipses in our time together. And as predicted by a genius economist who won a Nobel Prize for economy, but he really wanted to be a physicist, so he kept publishing astonishing physical papers and experiments and revelations. His name was Maurice Allais. He won the Nobel Economics Prize for his work in economics in '88, but his real work was in physics. He discovered during a total eclipse in 1959 in a basement laboratory in Paris, France, when the path of totality went across Paris like it's going to go across the United States on Monday noon, without even knowing there was an eclipse. He measured on his instrumentation in this basement a stunning hyperdimensional effect of aligning the Earth and the Sun and the Moon. Nothing in any known physics has predicted anything like this ever in the history of science. Ever, 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 ever. Not even relativity. So none of the physics that is talked about in public covers this very stupid, simple observation. So decades later, in my pursuit of the hyperdimensional model, I said to myself, what if I could use the Accutron to measure the effects that Allais measured during a total eclipse? And in 2012, we had an annular eclipse here in Albuquerque. I'm just north of Albuquerque. So we didn't have to even go anywhere. And the Accutron I'm talking about is a 1965 Bulova Accutron watch, which was the rage in the 50s. Even astronauts were buying them. NASA even put them in their spacecraft. And then they quietly took them out, as I'm going to explain momentarily why. Because the Accutron is the world's lousiest watch. It was billed by Bulova as the most accurate advance in timekeeping in 300 years. It turned out, from my measurements, that it's a lousy timekeeper. Why? Because it responds to the changes in the background hyperdimensional physics, which, unlike conventional physics, does not have constants. The constants are part of a constantly changing background reality envelope we term the ether. And all of reality around us manifests from a changing background as opposed to a constant background. So things we think of as constants, like the gravitational constant or the speed of light, they're variable. Or what happens during an alignment during an eclipse. Because what I found, and the reason the Accutron was perfect, is because at the heart of the Accutron was not a balance wheel or a wound spring or even little pendulum weights, if you can imagine that in a wristwatch. It was an electrically powered tuning fork that sat inside 2 coils. You know what magnets look like, little, what they used to call fork magnets, where you had a handle and then you have one pole going up on the left and on the right, and each of them is like north and south. If you wrap copper wire, in the size of the watch, incredibly fine copper wire, around those vertical little pieces of metal, and you put a tuning fork between them, it will vibrate back and forth in synchronization with the electrical pulses from the battery. So the advance that Bulova put on everybody's wrist was a watch that was electrically powered that used a tuning fork to keep time, as opposed to methods that were traditional going back in a wound watch hundreds of years. Why did that make a difference? Because in the in the in the cone of the eclipse, when you got the sun and the moon and the earth, if you stand in any part of the terrain covered by the moon's shadow, this means either totality or even when the moon just touches the edge of the sun, the tuning fork in the accutron goes nuts. It should not. Nothing should change the vibration of a given tuning fork of a given size and mass. Nothing in any known equation of mainstream science. But I can show you graphs. In fact, I sent you one or two, I think, to put up on the show, showing what happens to the frequency of the accutron tuning fork simply being in the shadow of the moon against the sun, just being physically in the shadow. Nothing like this should exist. And yet it obviously, overwhelmingly, redundantly does. It did. Robin and I were able to measure 3 eclipses, and I'm going to measure the 4th without her. The point is, it shows with one simple experiment that a lot of the things we have been taught as gospel are not true, even in the sciences. So if I can put a tuning fork in the shadow of the moon and it changes its vibration rate, and every scientist says that's nuts, that's impossible, why couldn't there be a 20-mile high glass layered dome around the moon? Is any one more impossible than the other? No, because once you open the door to aliens, once you open the door to species that may not be a few million years old like we are, but billions of years old, what could they have figured out about how the universe really works that we are clueless about yet, which includes the control of gravity, the control of inertia, which of course is what the little accutron is showing us. Inertia is not constant. It can be changed. Now, in our history of science, we find out that if the universe is doing something, eventually human beings have figured out how to do it too, right? So if the universe is showing us anti-gravity, changes of inertia and mass that are impossible by current equations, is it not possible that some incredibly advanced ancient ET species figured that out a long time ago? And they use that knowledge to build the damn dome that we look at and say, oh, that's impossible. No, it's not. Think bigger. Think like Arthur Clarke and Olaf Stapledon and Robert Heinlein and all those giants who taught us in the 50s and 60s there's no limit to what can happen, only your imagination. You just have to think big enough and look far enough. Remember, it was Heinlein who said, once you're in Earth orbit, you're halfway to anywhere.
I wanted to ask you about the occult, and would this eclipse be significant for them? And if so, who and what would they be doing during the eclipse? Are they performing rituals?
Well, the occult to me is just another name for hyperdimensional physics. And the reason it's occult, which means hidden, in fact, technically an eclipse is called an occultation because it's hiding the thing it's occulting. The moon is occulting the sun. It's hiding the sun. So yeah, the question, are there occult ceremonies and rituals going on during the eclipse? Of course there are. That's what human beings do. Because what somebody realized a long, long time ago, and it's come down to us as kind of warped, suppressed, distorted, half-assed knowledge, there is also a technology in the hyperdimensional physics that can be carried out by human minds, by consciousness. And if you put a lot of the consciousness together, particularly during, let's say, an eclipse, when the physics is amplified, you might be able to achieve some of the amazing consciousness experiments that Art Bell and George Noory achieved with their audiences, including saving my life. When I had the heart attack decades ago and Robin rushed in to physically save me, well, the audience of Coast to Coast rushed in terms of spiritual salvation. And they focused their minds, millions of people, on me not dying and getting better. And I did. And I say definitely, unequivocally, the role of consciousness and hyperdimensional physics had a major part in that. So, yes, the answer is yes. Whoever's doing anything during this eclipse is doing it to work power to create a mind over matter scenario, and they have a higher probability of succeeding if they combine their efforts with a lot of other efforts, and that's where we get so-called mass consciousness experiments, which is why I'm here talking to you right now.
And that's essentially what it seems like CERN is trying to achieve, at least on some level, with their experiment.
Well, if the physical constants don't exist, if everything really is measurably different, then remember, the eclipse is over the United States. It's not even physically over CERN. But when the shadow of the moon, in alignment with the sun, crosses the Earth from one edge to the other, that effect, that hyperdimensional inertia changing effect I just described, and which you can see on the graphs, that effect might be detectable at CERN if you do your experiment when the alignment with the sun is perfect, like when the shadow is crossing the core, which, remember, rotates at a different rate than the surface of the Earth. And in the physics, in HD physics, the key to understanding any phenomena is rotation, rotation, rotation. So, yeah, I can well imagine they're doing eclipses at CERN to measure higher level parameters of a physics they don't even acknowledge exists.
Wanted to ask you briefly about the red heifer sacrifice. A lot of people are talking about this with the timing of, it could
We're
be.
getting farther and farther from my wheelhouse.
Okay, yeah.
I know the mythology. I can think of one potential reason why red heifers and eclipses and the visibility of the ancient gods, if you know what you're looking at, might all come together. And that has to do with the role of cows in human evolution. It has to do with cattle mutilations seen around the world since the 70s. It has to do with the idea that NASA does rituals, even if they don't talk about it. And when you put all this together, the red heifer and the eclipse could be a significator of a connection between humanity and Mars, because a lot of the ancient rituals were done with red ochre. The very name of in Genesis, the progenitor of the human race, Adam, really means red earth. So red earth, red heifer, red mixing genes, red humans out of a very complicated, interfered with ET process. You kind of put it all together and it smushes out to somebody's playing with something they don't know the full picture thereof.
Now, speaking of Mars, you are pretty much you're known as the Mars guy. You're the one who discovered the
I
face on
hate
Mars.
it. I hate it. It's like Shatner being typecast as Kirk. I can never get beyond Mars. And we
Well,
found this whole astonishing thing around the moon. So
correct. I just wanted to ask you briefly, what do you think Elon's obsession is with Mars? Why is he trying to bring humanity and people to Mars? That's like
because he knows everything I've talked about for the last hour. Are you kidding? It's going to be Elon's tourists. Remember the 9 artists he's taking in a journey in a starship around the moon in the next couple of years? 9 civilian artists, not military, not deep state, but, 18 eyeballs looking down on the moon, seeing with their own Twitter accounts. Oh, I'm sorry, X. Did Musk buy X so that he can have exclusive franchise rights to twittering or Xing close-up color images of the dome from 9 pet artists? You damn well bet he has. That's why he bought Twitter. They cannot block what those artists are going to see when they go into lunar orbit in a starship in just 2 years. And guess what? We are in touch directly with 2 of them. And we are backgrounding them on what to look for, what to photograph, and what to send to Earth, which, if it doesn't now, in 2 years will change everything. And by the way, Spiro, you're hearing it here tonight first. I have not put all this together like I've done on your show. I'm supposed to do Charles Lewis on Friday, and I'm not sure we're going to get into the depth that I've done here.
Wow. Well, Richard, it's been so great having you on. I know that you're short on time, and we've had some technical difficulties that we both worked through to make this happen, and I really do appreciate your time very much. And where is the best place that people can go to find you and your work, Richard?
TheOtherSideOfMidnight.com.
There you have it, folks. And, lots to consider as we navigate through these.
And later tonight, The Other Side of Midnight, beginning at 9 o'clock Pacific, we're actually doing a whole eclipse weekend. Tonight is one show. Tomorrow night, Sunday night, is another show. So just join us on the internet. Just go to The Other Side of Midnight. You can click on the links there. You'll hear a live stream, and it doesn't cost you a penny.
There you have it, folks. Again, thanks so much, Richard, for your time. This is Richard C. Hoagland. Very great to have you on the show, and I look forward. We'll have to do a post-eclipse
gotta
recap.
do this again, because wait till you see the images people are going to send to us of the eclipse.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that, and if people can post those images underneath this post as well, and we can take a look at all of that stuff. So I'm looking forward to it. Is there any kind of, there's lots of doomer and gloomers. Last question, lots of doom and gloomers out there. Is there anything crazy we should expect with the eclipse? We're already seeing earthquakes and stuff, but, we have earthquakes all the time. Anything like that we should be concerned about, Richard?
All right. This eclipse, remember, I've been working on the hyperdimensional physics model for something like 30, 40 years. A key number that comes out of that work is 19.5. It's what we call the upwelling angle of energies inside stars and planets that emerge in a coordinate system which is expressed in latitude and longitude. On Earth, the big upwelling is Hawaii. The Hawaiian Islands are an example of hyperdimensional physics spurting energy from the core of the Earth up to the surface at 19.5. This eclipse on Monday noon is occurring exactly 19.5 degrees after the first point of Aries on the zodiac, which is the official beginning of spring, of a rebirth, of a redawn, of a resurrection. Can I get any more explicit? Yes, I'm expecting big things in the wake of the eclipse. We're at the edge of forever.
Perfectly said. Thank you so much, Richard. I'm Spiro, and thanks for tuning in.